Can you imagine living in a church for 3 years and having to stay there if you wanted to see your family? That's what happened to an Ohio woman, Edith Espinel Moreno. Moreno was 16 when she immigrated from Mexico, and she went on to build a new life in the United States, marrying and having children. She applied for asylum, but her application was rejected and she got a deportation order. So a Mennonite church in Columbus, Ohio offered her sanctuary until February 2021, when she was able to live with her family again, thanks to renewed guidelines under the Biden administration.
The tradition of churches as places of refuge goes back centuries and also played a role in U.S. history, with enslaved people refuging in churches in the 1800s and people escaping the draft doing so in the 20th century. And in 2011, ICE sent out a memo telling officers not to arrest people in sensitive locations, such as churches, schools, hospitals, and public demonstrations, unless they posed a clear danger, or if there were other exceptions. Now, though, the role of churches as sanctuaries has become uncertain, as the current administration has stripped churches and schools of their immigration enforcement protections.
But where did this tradition originate, and what does the Catholic Church teach about offering sanctuary? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask but not so easy to answer. Emily, hi, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I am really excited about this conversation. I've always long been enthralled by kind of almost the romantic angle on the church as a sanctuary, probably from having read The Hunchback of Notre Dame at a young age and having that image in my head of Quasimodo shouting sanctuary, sanctuary. And then it comes up in other literature as well. And I've always loved this idea that the church plays such an important role in human life, and especially the lives of the vulnerable, that they can flee into a church and take refuge there. And I had always thought, if I'm in trouble, I can take refuge in a church, but perhaps not so much anymore.
As I was preparing for this conversation, I was trying to Google where else I had come across sanctuary churches besides the sanctuary movement and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I found that it comes up in old Robin Hood TV shows a lot, with Robin Hood running to escape the sheriff and then running into a church and touching it and saying, "Oh, sanctuary!" And then the sheriff can't do anything. So I think there's the idea of sanctuary is all tied up in my mind with the church's social justice work of feeding the poor, taking from the rich to give to the poor, feeding the poor.
Now, there's an interesting angle on that I really didn't start thinking about until more recently, which is, we're having these images of people taking refuge in churches who are vulnerable, who are innocent, or who might not be innocent before the law, but if they've broken the law, it was for the sake of a higher law morality, like Robin Hood. But, presumably sanctuary also extended to people who were not, people with whom we would automatically have empathy, or people who were clearly innocent under God's law. I mean, that really opens up fascinating conversations about religious freedom under the law. Where does the church's protection end, and where does civil authority begin? And that's something that I think that this conversation will help clarify.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're talking about on this episode. The Christian tradition of offering sanctuary, the significance of sanctuary churches across history, and how this pertains specifically to issues today. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Today's podcast topic is sanctuary, its significance in both the Christian tradition and contemporary politics.
To help us answer our question, we talked to theologian Leo Guardado. As a child, Guardado fled the Civil War in El Salvador and grew up in Los Angeles, California. After spending some time in a Cistercian monastery, he pursued a Master of Theological Studies in Patristics and a doctorate degree in both systematic theology and international peace studies at the University of Notre Dame.
Guardado has worked ecumenically in the borderlands near Tucson, Arizona, collaborating with churches, dioceses, and NGOs in defense of migrant communities. He is the author of numerous articles and 2 books, including Church as Sanctuary, Reconstructing Refuge in an Age of Forced Displacement, from Orbis Books.
Leo, thanks so much for joining us. I'm glad you asked.
Glad to be here.
So, to start out with, could you say a little bit about what sanctuary is and what the origins of this idea are in the Christian tradition, especially for our audience members who might not know what it is we're talking about?
Sure. Technically, sanctuary is, given its linguistic background, a holy place and a place of refuge. I like to think of it as sanctuary is that which is made holy, a place that is made holy because refuge is provided. As we think about the background of this concept and this religious and tradition of humanity, I would say there's pre-Christian context that it's important, I think, to take into account. It's already present in Greek and Roman traditions. The sanctuaries of the gods were places where the gods had authority and domain, and you could not persecute and you could not capture people who sought out the protection of the gods. So that's recognized in the Roman context of Christianity. And it's really a living tradition of the culture of Roman and Greek culture and of its kind of pagan religions before it ever enters into Christianity.
When you talk about sanctuary as this holy space, can you talk about sanctuary without talking about religion or God?
It's a great question because we talk about the holy already within the notion of sanctuary. It is something that has to do with whether we call it God or an energy or that which is beyond, I think, just the domain of human control and human power. So most of the time we speak of sanctuary as exceeding just the human. However, I think that I particularly deal with church sanctuary, but I think we can speak of sanctuary in ways that are maybe more relevant to a contemporary secular context as places really where life is affirmed from the small actions of human encounter, of healing relationships, where relationships, love really becomes actualized in history. We could theoretically speak of that in sanctuary. And there are current scholars who really are expanding this notion. My work has kind of gone in the other direction of trying to ensure that we do not lose some of the more traditional understandings of sanctuary for strategic reasons, I think for important reasons that have to do with the church and the future of the church in this world.
Now, sanctuary is such a vivid idea culturally. Even if people aren't familiar with the idea from a theological standpoint, they may have an image from, say, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, whether the novel or the film. I always think of Quasimodo rushing into the church carrying Esmeralda and shouting sanctuary. I think it's come up in some Arthurian legends. Are these ideas, these vivid images, accurate? Especially in the Middle Ages, what did sanctuary mean and how was it used?
So I'm not sure if it's accurate, given that it's a Disney film, but I think what it points to is really that core kernel, the core gem of a tradition that exceeded simply religion. So as we think about the Middle Ages, maybe I should back up and talk about where does the Middle Ages actually get that tradition. And so here, let me mention earlier Christian kind of instantiations of this. So I mentioned the Greek and the Roman context. And then goes into Christianity. Really, first references are in the 300s, 343 at the Council of Serdica. There's a bishop's council where refuge in churches becomes an issue. It's really the bishops are taking refuge in churches. So before we even talk about people, poor people, women who were being persecuted, it was bishops who were taking sanctuary in other churches because they were being persecuted by the secular leaders of their cities during the Arian controversy, different theological arguments taking place. And after 343, it really gets mentioned much more in some of the most brilliant theologians of the day, in their discourses, in their homilies, and funeral sermons. We're talking to people like Ambrose of Milan and John Chrysostom, Augustine of Hippo. So there's this amazing pedigree when it comes to references to sanctuary in the early church. It then begins to get codified into secular law, into the law of the empire and empires, and into the beginnings of canon law around the 500s is when this begins. And so by the time we get to the Middle Ages, we've undergone a process of codification of sanctuary and a diversification of these codifications, because it will be different to talk about sanctuary in England under English law than in the Iberian Peninsula, for example, under the Visigothic kingdoms, or in other parts of Europe. So in the example that you bring up of Quasimodo and Notre Dame, it's in a way, this appeal to this universal notion that a cathedral was a place of refuge, and that when someone was being persecuted, and when it was a matter of life and death, someone could seek refuge in the church. It was not guaranteed necessarily. In the early church references, kings had to leave their weapons outside the door before going inside. And so this would have been something similar with its codifications in the medieval ages. You had to also leave weapons outside because it was a holy place. It was a place of peace. It was also, in its codifications, it was very regulated. So in some instances, you could only be there for 30 days. And what did those 30 days get you? Well, the possibility of a resolution to whatever conflict there was with the secular law. And what would happen, let's say, after 30 days? Well, either you were going to be turned into the legal system for whatever consequences, or you had to abjure the realm, so like leave radically, which was another form of death, you could say, or avoiding death. So these were some of the regulations that accompanied it. But in general, it is a tradition whose primary purpose at the core of it is the protection of life for whoever seeks it, regardless of what the reasons may be, at least initially.
So you talked a little bit about the codification that happens over the centuries, which gets at my next question, which was, has the Catholic Church ever endorsed sanctuary at kind of the highest levels?
I would say certainly. I mentioned canon law and the origins of canon law. So sanctuary was already being mentioned in episcopal documents, in bishops' conferences, before there was even canon law. So by the time canon law emerges in the 500s and onwards, and it gets codified around the turn of the millennium, sanctuary, or the right of asylum in churches, is already there. And it's there in all of the emendations and in all of the versions until the new code comes out in 1983. I think of canon law as the legal code, really, of the church, how the church understands itself, the polity of the church. So the fact that it was there, I'm going to say, for 1,700 years or so, 1,500 plus years, is no small detail when talking about this religious tradition and really this tradition of humanity. I think of sanctuary as a real heritage of humanity writ large now.
So what happened in 1983? Why did it get taken out?
Yes, that took me a while to figure out, because I knew it was taken out. So the last reference before 1983 was the Code of Canon Law from 1917, where it still affirms in Canon 1179, it affirms that persons have a right of asylum in churches and that they cannot be taken out of there without the explicit authority of the clergy person. And in some commentaries, they say that clause about without the explicit authority of the clergy person actually means that if, let's say, a secular authority wants to drag out the person, the clergy person can move them to another place or so forth. It's supposed to almost strengthen that the authority of people taking refuge in churches. Vatican II happens in the 1960s, as we know. After Vatican II, there is a process that begins to try to update the Code of Canon Law from 1917 in order for it to better reflect the spirit of the Church after Vatican II. And so in 1971, a commission gathers in Rome to start looking at the various canons of the Code of Canon Law. And one of these is the one that references asylum in churches. A discussion ensues. This is what the records show from the Vatican. A discussion ensues. And some people in the commission say, you know what? People don't really claim sanctuary anymore. And the laws have been humanized. And they said, like, we don't need it. We should just get rid of it. Some other people on the commission said, well, but it's part of our tradition. So why don't we keep it? And why don't we actually codify it more so that it reflects something like the embassies? Is that embassies are these places of immunity in the modern world, right? So why don't we have protocols where people can request protections in churches like embassies of the church, we could say. No agreement was reached, and so it was left there. But in 1979, a new commission gathered, and I'm not sure how many of the same people were there. And the discussion ensued again. People don't really seek it. Laws have been humanized, and it was decided that they would just remove reference to it. From my perspective, of course, to say that laws have been humanized was a rather particular view of legality in the modern world. The upshot of all this is that all reference to asylum in churches or sanctuary in churches disappeared from canon law. So the 1983 version does not prohibit sanctuary churches, but it doesn't affirm it either. It just makes absolutely no mention of it.
And this seems especially striking considering the fact that some of our laws apparently haven't been as humanized as we would like them to be. I'm wondering, how might our practices be different? How might we think about refugees in a different way, for instance, if we had kept this idea of sanctuary in canon law?
Yeah, it's it's one of these hypothetical questions, of course. I think the reference to asylum in churches, even that word asylum in churches, would force us to conceptually think deeper about what it means to protect and whose domain is asylum. Because contemporary notions of asylum in countries within sovereign nation states finds its root in this deeper tradition of asylum in churches or asylum in the sanctuaries. Asylum in the Greek tradition, in the Greek language, is that which cannot be plundered, that which cannot be done violence unto. So the very word asylum, is that which must be protected and safeguarded. I'm going to say in its deepest level, life that must be affirmed. So I think had we kept references to sanctuary, to this holy place that is a place of refuge, or where holiness is enacted because refuge is enacted, would be a greater invitation for making this link between what appears to be at times just a secular ethical or moral action, and then the theological, spiritual, salvific, we would even say, dimensions of such practices. This would force us to not separate the political and the religious, or the salvific and the historical, which is always a temptation, I would say, within our faith.
So I wanted to talk about the sanctuary movement here in the United States. Can you give us a brief history of what that was and how that movement connected with this history that we've just been talking about, history and theology?
Thank you for that question. This is one of the great, I'm going to say, tragedies, ironies, that as sanctuary is disappearing from the Code of Canon Law, sanctuary in churches is emerging in the United States, at least, in a way that had not taken place really not in the United States at that scale ever. In Europe, it had during World War II, as networks were developed to protect people and to save human lives. During, of course, the persecution of Jews. There's various networks that were developed, the Assisi network, for example, which was just a network of convents and religious homes that protected people. So that was a point of reference already for the emergence of the sanctuary movement in the 1980s. So this begins what initially was called the Ministry of Sanctuary. It was not called a movement, it was a ministry. And this begins in southern Arizona, really in Tucson, Arizona, in July, right around July 4th, 1980. And it begins when 26 Salvadorans, I'm from El Salvador, so this is a story that connects right with my own personal history. Really, it was middle-class Salvadorans who left what was a context of life and death. The war was starting already. They got lost in Organ Pipe National Monument, which is out in the deserts west of Tucson, Arizona. And of the 26 who got lost there, about, I think, 10 survived, 3 were never found. And then the rest just perished in the desert. So those who survived, who were found, and eventually by Border Patrol, were taken to Tucson and to hospitals. And already the process began for deporting them back to El Salvador, And there, at that moment, the Bishop of Tucson, Arizona, the Catholic bishop, along with Presbyterian leaders, Methodist leaders, Jewish rabbis, they said, whoa, you can't just send them back once they get better, what? And they started to talk to the people who had survived about why they had come to the U.S. And this started a whole process of essentially bailing them out from deportation proceedings, putting in the legal support, the financial support, the social psychological support to protect them and to ensure that they stayed in the United States. One of those who survived, actually, Dora Rodriguez, she lives in Tucson, Arizona now, and she has started a whole organization in defense of migrants. So it's amazing full circle. From that tragedy in 1980, a process, really a transnational process, began of discerning what exactly was happening down there in El Salvador. Oscar Romero had already been killed months before, and for some, that would have been a point of reference, but probably not for most people. But 6 months later, the American churchwomen were killed in December of 1980, and that would have been a more, perhaps for some significant moment because they were American. And so that began to put in the consciousness of North Americans, of the United States people, the question of what in the world is happening in El Salvador. And as consciousness of the war, the beginnings of the war, increased, so did the responses to protect people and the networks to ensure that that those who made it were not going to be deported right back to the war. And so as more people arrived, and because hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans ended up leaving El Salvador primarily to the United States, as more and more people were arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border, they had nowhere to go. And so some of the clergy persons, I'm thinking of people like John Fife, I said the Catholic bishop of the Tucson diocese, and other lay workers in parishes, they began to organize homes that served as places of refuge. So initially, it was not churches, it was just homes. Hey, we 3 people were crossing over, we helped them. We want to make sure they don't just get deported back to El Salvador, so they would bring them home. As homes started to fill up, people started to talk to their pastors, to their clergy leaders, and saying, can people stay in the church? And this began a process of discernment in many churches. Southside Presbyterian Church was one of the main key points of reference there, and is to this day when it comes to sanctuary work. But really, this began to expand in the Southwest. It then became evident that the network needed to grow beyond the Southwest. If the point was to protect people so that they would not be apprehended and sent back to El Salvador to a war, then a network was needed that could move them deeper or farther north into the United States. And so there was an agreement made with organizations in Chicago where a national network really began, and to coordinate churches, convents, universities. And so it expanded quickly in the early 80s, say 83, for example. You already have from San Francisco to Benedictine monasteries in Boston, and a network that is moving people and transporting people from southern Arizona and the Southwest across, even to Canada. And you also have networks of leaders, some of them clergy, some of them not, down in Mexico, helping guide people north. This was a way of protecting them, again, so that they could reach, you could say, a safe haven of sorts. So that's the origin of what became, I said, a network that started as a ministry, really, with churches. And this went on for years. The major high point was in the mid-1980s, 1985. There was a major trial. The FBI infiltrated the network with a man they named Jesus. And one operation the FBI named Operation Sojourner. So that evidence was used to bring people to trial. And after the trial, it only increased even more. But as laws began to change, it more or less faded, you could say, by the end of the 1980s. Churches also sued the government for rejecting asylum cases. And the government settled with the churches, essentially accepting that they had not exercised the law fairly. So that decade of the 1980s became, I would say, the modern instantiation of the tradition of sanctuary in the United States. And it's still a point of reference of what's possible when 500 places of worship collaborate across difference to protect people who are seeking life, and not to be deported back to places where their life may be threatened.
Is this movement still around? Is this mission still around? And if so, has the practice evolved at all since the 1980s?
Yes and yes. The movement is around in various forms. In the early 2000s, really it's what began as normally referenced as the New Sanctuary movement. So different modes of accompaniment, more and more it's a matter of keeping families together, people who have been here for a long time, and there was less recent arrivals, for example, which was really the case in the 1980s. So versions of the movement are absolutely around, and the 1980s is a point of reference for these new movements. And I will also add, it's not only around in the United States, but in Germany, there is a network of about 200 places of worship, a lot of them in the evangelical churches, that take inspiration and that from time to time seek advice from these communities in the 1980s. So it's much more than just the United States. I said what happened in the 80s in terms of the sanctuary ministry that then became the sanctuary movement is a global point of reference for what sanctuary can look like, and also what has been learned from the experience, and maybe how not to replicate certain mistakes or certain limitations. As I said, one of the main differences is the emphasis now on keeping families together. So this is affirming kind of family unity against family separation. And there's different approaches to when it should be used or invoked. There are times, I think, when it may be used almost as a political platform in defense of migrant communities. And I want to emphasize that I think sanctuary is a last emergency stopgap in one sense. To go into sanctuary, in one sense, can be like going into prison. I mean, you are locked up, for lack of a better word, in a church. That is not pleasant. You may be living there for weeks, for months, or for years. And in the 2017, 2019, there are cases where people were in a church for 3-4 years, not leaving church property. So this goes back to those medieval references. If you left the church property or the codified space of protection, then you were You could be apprehended, you could be arrested by the officials of the law. And so it's not, I would say, it cannot, from my perspective, it ought not to be used as a political platform in defense of migrants. Rather, it is an emergency measure to protect life, to keep families together when needed. And when it is invoked, it is that people are choosing to invoke and knowing full well the costs of being in a church for a long time without being able to leave. The reality, just to add another dimension, is if in the medieval ages there was a certain respect for immunities, for protections that were kind of negotiated between the kingdoms and the church, that does not exist here. There is no legal protection of people in churches. In 2011, there was a memo from an ICE memo that called churches a sensitive location, but ICE could still go into any church. That remained more or less active, you could say, as the tradition. Don't go into churches to apprehend people. Trump made it very clear that there is nothing protecting any space, that all is the U.S. property. And ICE agents have essentially made that very clear verbally. If people say, well, this is private property, I said, there is no private property. All of this is our property. It's a way of communicating that they can go, if they so choose, into any church and arrest anyone, apprehend anyone. Of course, it's bad PR, but I think we're kind of getting beyond letting bad PR keep certain actions out of the public eye. So even now, if anyone were to go into sanctuary, it is, in a way, it's from the government's perspective, it's fair game.
So given where we are today, are there examples of Catholic parishes, organizations that still consider sanctuary an important part of their mission and are trying to live that out, even if it looks a little bit different than it did in the 80s?
I'm going to say that there are definitely Catholics and Catholic communities of faith, and the church is we, the people, followers of Jesus. So certainly the Catholic Church is part of the broader, Christian tradition that affirms sanctuary. I do not know currently of any bishop or really any clergy person who has in the Catholic tradition, who has publicly affirmed that that particular parish is a place of sanctuary. Sanctuary, in a way, became a bad word in the Catholic Church. It's a word that you don't say, that you don't touch. And in fact, bishops explicitly locate themselves at a distance from just the very category, the very word, concept, practice of sanctuary. It is, from the bishop's perspective, generally speaking, too politicized. It's too much going against the government, and so it's just not spoken of. In 2017, there were even some bishops who wrote letters to clergy persons, in their diocese, saying, you cannot provide sanctuary, so don't think about it, and they gave the reasons why. So there's been a definite prohibition against it from some bishops. I do not know of any who have explicitly affirmed it. Having said that, shouldn't say maybe say most, but there are bishops who affirm that they will protect migrants, that they will accompany migrants, and they do in other modes. What I think is lost in this fear of sanctuary is essentially that we are rejecting one of our core traditions as a Christian and as a Catholic Church. And I think it's to our advantage to retrieve the richness of this tradition and to understand not only how it was part of how we understood ourselves as church and our mission in the world, but that it's got richness and it's got a potential for an amazing collaboration, of coalition building across difference in an age when forced displacement is only getting worse and when the disappearances of people and family separation is increasing. So there's a lot of work, I think, to be done for clergy people, for bishops, and for parishes to begin a process of not fearing sanctuary, of learning more about it, of understanding their own religious tradition, and to not too quickly pit it against politics, as though religion and politics were antithetical to each other. They are always, if we're going to be mature in our Christian faith, it's a matter of understanding the political implications of our faith. We don't live in a world that pretends to be separate from politics. The incarnation the incarnation of God in history forces us to take seriously that we live in this one history where we work out what it means to follow Jesus. And so sanctuary, I think, forces those, or better said, invites us into this deep spiritual journey of how we become a church of Christ, faithful to the following of Jesus, with their sisters and brothers forced to leave their own countries.
On that note, some people argue that churches or Catholics who offer sanctuary are breaking the law, and that this is bad when they keep people without documents from being legally deported. Can you talk a little bit about how Catholics can navigate this tension between civil law and our moral and theological commitments?
The first thing that I will say is that every person of faith in the Christian tradition, I think, has an obligation to take seriously what it means to be a good citizen. I mean, this is part of being responsible people in the world. Having said that, we have a profound responsibility to think our faith. What does it mean to be mature in our faith? And to wrestle with those areas where being a good citizen and being a good person of faith don't match up for whatever reason. So we're talking about one encounter here in the protection of life. I am not of the mindset that we should see politics and religion, or politics and faith, as different or bifurcated. I said I think the incarnation and integral understanding of faith invites us to see the political implications of everything that we do. We are always and already given to a political context. The question is always, do we affirm the status quo of the political context that we're born into, that we're raised into, and really enculturated into, or do we work to transform that context, loss and otherwise, in a way that represents the gospel, the following of Jesus in history, the love for neighbor? So I don't want to pit one against the other, but at one point or another, each one of us may be faced with the harrowing decision of, as a professor of mine once put it, is the flag higher than the cross? Is the cross higher than the flag? Maybe we don't want to say one is higher than the other because we want both to be equally, and that can also be dangerous. As someone who was born in El Salvador during the Civil War, Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was killed while saying Mass, is a point of reference, and he would speak about the idolatry of national security. So I think when it comes to a topic as contentious or controversial as sanctuary, we have to ask ourselves, what are my idols? Am I making the national state an idol? Am I making legality an idol? Because we're all very familiar the way that laws may not be just. You just have to turn to Martin Luther King and his statements, or think about World War II, or just really the broader history and the colonial histories of this Western world. To have something codified legally does not mean that it is just. Sanctuary forces us to think through legality and to question what quickly becomes legal and illegal. If sanctuary is rendered illegal, if the protection of life is rendered illegal, if providing basic human needs to people, such as water or food, or at times shelter, is rendered illegal, we have deeper questions about what it means to be human and Christian that are at stake here. And sanctuary invites us to think about those. So I'm not going to say providing sanctuary is illegal. I think we have to go deeper and question the very nature of legality right now in a shifting, especially right now in this shifting landscape where criminalization is essentially whatever one wants it to be. And there, I believe the bishops and we, the church, have a lot of work to do in resisting narratives that create legality and illegality in facile ways. Protecting life is never illegal. And one of the mottos of the humanitarian groups in Southern Arizona, which arose out of the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, is humanitarian aid is never a crime.
So we always end these conversations by asking our guests, what's the most important thing that you would like listeners to take away from this conversation?
We being the Roman Catholic Church, are living through a synodal process. Or I hope we are, at least. That's the invitation that Pope Francis has left us. There are 3 more years of the implementation phase, and it is a process that has faced a lot of resistance around the world. It is a process that gathers, I think, the richness of the Latin American ecclesial experience, of liberation theology, of base communities, of taking seriously the challenges of poverty and marginalization, but now global. And every community around the world, every local church is being asked to think deeply about what it means to be church and how we are going to be church for the future. When bishops tell their clergy that they cannot provide sanctuary, I believe it is against the spirit of synodality. The very spirit of synodality invites everyone to have a voice at the table. And so what I think is necessary is to move forward, because in my opinion, this is only going to get worse. This being mass forced displacement, apprehensions, deportations. We're seeing it happen over and over. We have a huge responsibility, which is to begin discerning, spiritually discerning as people of faith, what it means for us, for every particular parish, to accompany migrant communities and to begin that synodal process of thinking their faith in relation to migrants, to people who are forcibly placed, to people who may be in deportation proceedings. So that is one thing, is we need to take synodality at the local level seriously in relation to questions like sanctuary. Number 2, I think at the very kind of high level of Vatican work, sanctuary ought to be reintroduced into the Code of Canon Law as a point of reference of who we are, not as a legal right, because the church does not have, this is not the medieval ages. We do not have these Holy Roman Empire realities. No, well, we live in a modern nation secular state. But we can reintroduce references to the Code of Canon Law that affirm this as a religious tradition, not as a legal right, but as a religious tradition that we are responsible for, the protection of persons in churches, asylum in churches, as part of what it means to be church. Because that serves as a resource for people at the local parish level. When a local ecclesiastical leader says that you can't do this, if a parishioner can turn to the Code of Canon Law and say, but there's reference to this as part of the Christian tradition in the code, that's quite something. And then number 3, I'm going to say, and I'll end with this, Pope Francis's papacy and his teaching on migration and forced displacement and refugees can be summarized in the 4 verbs that he would emphasize all the time: to welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate. I mean, that is the core, the 4 pillars of Pope Francis's teaching on migration: welcome, protect, promote, integrate. All of that is sanctuary. To welcome people into our community, not just into the 4 walls of a church building, but into the church that is the community. To welcome, to protect them from the persecution, from the deportation, in the accompaniment, to find a way out of negotiations with the government, to put in the legal aid, the financial assistance, etc. To promote their gifts and their agency, to choose where they reside, to not be separated from their family, to bring gifts into a new community who takes them in, to accompanies them. And I said to integrate them for the long term, not only into the local faith communities, if they so desire, but into the broader society. I would say sanctuary is as natural to what it means to be Catholic Christian now as it was in the 300s or in the 1500s. 1800s. What we've lost is really our understanding of our own identity. And as we look at the future, mass forced displacement, and now at over 120 million persons worldwide and increasing, we have a lot of discernment to do about who we are going to be as church for the future with our sisters and brothers in displacement.
That's all our questions for today. We're so glad you could join us for this discussion.
Thank you for having me here.
So, Rebecca, what did you think about our conversation?
I found this very enlightening, perhaps in some respects a little bit depressing, but it was a really helpful conversation for clarifying the situations that we face in the United States today and helping to situate that in the context of history in general and also church history.
Was there anything that surprised you?
So I'm a little surprised that sanctuary used to be in canon law and then got taken out. It seems like something that should have remained in. Granted, canon law isn't dogma. It has to change and shift depending on how the circumstances that we're living in shift. But it relates to doctrine and it derives its moral guideline from the church's teachings on faith and morals. So it seems like even though they might have had to change that a bit, taking it out, I guess I can't say I approve of that. How about you?
I think the other thing that surprised me was that the sanctuary from its earliest times has been kind of a religious term, right? Even before Christianity, when it was used by Greek and Roman traditions, it had this religious connotation that sanctuary is this place that is holy because refuge is provided there. And I was struck by that just because I think now we think about sanctuary apart from religion or apart from theology. And the idea that these two things are so inextricably connected, I think we've lost that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, if the bishops are saying that the concept of sanctuary is too political, that seems very strange if the concept of sanctuary is, as you say, fundamentally religious. It's a holy place. And, what does that mean? As a holy place, we have this tradition of, take your shoes off if you're on holy ground, or approach the altar of God with fear of the Lord in Hebrew scriptures. So the idea of sanctuary really ought to be more of this idea of a sacred space where this is God's space. It's odd to me that it would have shifted to become a political thing.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of getting us to our next question, which is there anything that you wish that we had time to explore more?
Yeah, so if a Catholic church did decide, I think I want to know about kind of the logistics of it. Like if right now a Catholic church near me decided to offer sanctuary to immigrants, what would happen? And what specifically would the church do? What would the diocese do? Would Pope Leo get involved? What's the chain of command? Even if the civil authorities start cracking down and violating that sanctuary, what's the answer going to be from church leaders?
We keep talking about how much things have changed, that this administration is different than the previous Trump administration, that everything around immigrants is different. And I want to talk about, is it really? Were there other times when it was just as dangerous for churches to provide sanctuary, when it was just as frightening for communities to stand up and offer sanctuary? Is it really that different than it has been for the past more than 2,000 years, because this dates back to Roman and Greek times, right? And what did the bravery of churches and religious communities look like in these past times as they stood up and offered sanctuary to people who needed it?
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about the fact that we had churches offering sanctuary to enslaved people, and there were definitely churches that were there on behalf of justice and human dignity, but there were also a lot of churches that weren't. So, in that respect, also, I think that some of the challenges we're facing today, the moral challenges we're facing today, are not new. Maybe we're disgusted because we thought they'd gone away, and here they are back again.
And I also thought that Leo's point that at the same time that this is this big, scary thing that churches feel called to do, even the ones that do it, right? It's a big deal. It's also so true to who Pope Francis was. He pulled out those verbs that Pope Francis focused on in his papacy. I think it was welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. And then he explained, how these are such big aspects of what ministry is, and they all tie in really well to what sanctuary should be and means theologically. And that it's not this new thing. It's not a thing that just happens sometimes when immigrants are threatened. It's something that should be an integral part of how every religious community at every level understands why it's there. Which I think it gets us to our last question, which is, if you were to write a sermon or to preach a sermon on the topic, what would it be about?
I might go for a little bit of a severe Jesus approach and remind people of faith that offering sanctuary is something that Jesus taught very clearly in the Gospels when he said, welcome the stranger. And this is not a metaphor and it's not a symbol. And there's actually pretty intense penalties attached to not doing so, according to Jesus' own words. And I would invite people to reflect on that.
Both this episode and last week's episode where we talked about civil disobedience have dealt with this tension between the law and faith. And I think I would preach a sermon about the fact that there's always going to be a tension between our moral obligation and our civil law. And that doesn't mean that we are not called to act. And so I think I would preach a sermon about following the demands of our faith, even when that doesn't match up with what our nation says is the correct thing to do.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we talk about whether Catholics should read their horoscopes.
Before we wrap up, we're excited to share a new ministry for immigrants and anyone impacted by forced migration. This ministry is led by our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries. Somos, Together We Are Faith, Hope, and Strength, is a social media campaign offering spiritual care and resources for immigrants on their journey. Find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Help us spread the word and support the migrant community. To learn more, visit claretians.org.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Santa, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.